They laughed when she planted apple seeds in dead winter. They laughed until the trees bloomed in snow. Clara Bennett was 19 years old. The December she drove her rusted pickup truck up the frozen mountain road to the orchard that had been in her family for 4 generations. Bennett's Hollow Apple Farm. The sign hung crooked, weather-beaten, missing letters. What had once read as a promise now looked like a warning. Her grandfather had died 6 months earlier. The orchard had died long before that. The bank had been kind enough, or cruel enough, to give her until spring to make the payments or surrender the land. 300 acres of frozen dirt, skeletal trees, and a farmhouse with windows that rattled like old bones in the wind. The neighbors in Millbrook Valley had watched her arrive with the same expression they'd worn at her grandfather's funeral. Pity mixed with relief that it wasn't them. "Girls got more grief than sense," Old Man Hargrove muttered to anyone who'd listen at Millbrook Feed and Seed. "Planting season's 6 months away, if the ground ever thaws. She's throwing seeds into a graveyard." Clara heard the whispers. She'd heard them her whole life. Too young, too small, too much like her mother, who'd run off to the city and never looked back. Too little like her grandfather, who'd been a giant in work boots and flannel, whose hands could graft a tree blindfolded, and whose voice could silence a room. But Clara had something nobody knew about. In the weeks after the funeral, while the lawyers argued and the relatives picked through the house like crows, Clara had found her grandfather's journal. Not the neat record-keeping book he kept for taxes. A leather-bound volume, locked in a rusted toolbox beneath the workbench, that smelled of pipe tobacco and secrets, page after page of cramped handwriting, notes on soil pH and rootstock compatibility, sketches of apple varieties that didn't exist in any catalog, and tucked between the pages a wax paper envelope containing 12 seeds from the last Frostheart apple tree. Her grandfather had written about the Frostheart in the final entries, his handwriting shaky, the ink faded. A variety he'd developed in secret over 30 years, crossed from wild Siberian crabapples and an heirloom Baldwin he'd tracked down in an abandoned orchard in Maine, bred not for size or beauty, but for something impossible, trees that could bloom in snow. Not metaphor, he'd written, the words underlined 3 times, not poetry. Biology. The Frostheart doesn't wait for spring. It blooms when the world is hardest, roots deep in frozen ground, opens its petals to the ice. The cold doesn't kill it. The cold wakes it up. The journal detailed everything: the stratification method, the soil mixture, the planting depth, the prayer her grandfather had whispered over every seed, though Clara suspected that part was optional. She'd read those pages until the words burned behind her eyes. And then she'd made her decision. The ground was iron hard on the winter solstice when Clara walked out into the old north field, the one that caught the worst of the mountain wind and had been abandoned to thistle and scrub for a decade. She carried a steel digging bar, a bag of her grandfather's special compost mixture, and the 12 seeds in her coat pocket, wrapped in wax paper, warm against her heart. The thermometer on the porch read 7 degrees. Her breath came in clouds that crystallized on her scarf. The old apple trees stood around her like witnesses, dead, diseased, beyond saving. She didn't look at them. She looked at the empty rows where new life would go. Mrs. Calloway from the neighboring dairy farm spotted her from the road. The old woman stopped her truck, rolled down the window, and stared. "Clara Bennett, you have lost your mind," she called out, not unkindly. "The way you tell a child that fire is hot." "Maybe," Clara answered, positioning the digging bar against the frozen earth. "But I've got to try. Nothing grows in December, honey. The ground's locked up tighter than a bank vault. Those seeds'll rot before they sprout, if the mice don't get them first." Clara brought the bar down. The earth rang like a bell. A chip of frozen soil no bigger than a quarter broke free. "Then I'll keep digging," she said. Mrs. Calloway shook her head and drove away. By noon, half the valley knew that Jed Bennett's granddaughter had finally cracked under the weight of her inheritance. They said it at the diner. They said it at the hardware store. They said it in the pews of the Methodist church, voices low, heads shaking in that particular rhythm of rural sympathy. Poor girl. Lost her grandfather, lost her way, digging holes in frozen ground like a dog burying bones. Clara didn't stop. She couldn't feel her fingers by the third hole. The digging bar had raised blisters that burst and froze and burst again. But she dug 12 holes, exactly 12, spaced 10 feet apart in a row that ran straight as a promise toward the eastern ridge, where the sun first touched the valley each morning. Into each hole went a handful of the compost mixture, charcoal and bone meal, and something her grandfather called black gold that looked like ordinary dirt but smelled of life waiting to happen. Then a seed, then more compost. Then she packed the frozen earth back over each one, tamping it down with her boot, whispering her grandfather's words because she didn't have any of her own that felt big enough. "Grow," she told them. "Please, just grow." She marked each spot with a stake whittled from apple wood, tied with a strip of red cloth that fluttered in the wind like a defiant flag. That night, the temperature dropped to 4 below zero. Clara sat in the farmhouse kitchen, her hands wrapped in warm towels, staring out the window at the dark field. The red strips were invisible now, but she knew where they were. 12 points of hope in an ocean of darkness. She opened the journal again. Her grandfather had planted the first Frostheart seeds in 1989. Only 3 had germinated. 2 had died in a late frost. 1 had grown into a tree that produced fruit for 15 years before a blight took it. The seeds in her pocket were from that tree's last apple, the final hope of a 30-year dream. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Clara asked the empty kitchen. The pipes groaned in response. The wind threw sleet against the windows. But she knew. Her grandfather had been mocked too. When he'd first talked about apples that bloomed in winter, the agricultural extension agents had smiled their polite smiles. The other orchardists had laughed outright. Jed Bennett and his fairy tale fruit. Jed Bennett and his snow flowers. So he'd worked in secret, hidden the tree in the north field where nobody went, told everyone he'd given up on experiments and was just trying to keep the old trees alive a few more years. And now the secret was hers. She remembered being 7 years old, sitting on her grandfather's shoulders in the north field while he checked the old trees for blight. The sun had been warm that day, and the apples had hung heavy and red above her head. "Grandpa," she'd asked, "why do trees grow up instead of down?" He'd laughed, his whole body shaking beneath her. "Because, Clara girl, everything that wants to see the sun has to fight gravity first. Remember that. The fight is what makes the fruit sweet." She'd tucked those words away like a seed in dark soil, not understanding then that he was talking about more than trees. January arrived like a wolf. The valley disappeared under 3 feet of snow that fell in a single weekend and stayed, unmelting, through weeks of gray skies and biting wind. The mountain road closed twice. Clara ran out of heating oil and had to burn wood in the old fireplace, waking every 2 hours to feed the flames, her nose cold above the blankets, her dreams filled with ice. She walked to the north field every morning. The stakes were buried now, red cloth frozen into the snow like blood on white linen. She'd stand at the edge of the row and listen, though there was nothing to hear but wind. She'd brought a stethoscope from her grandfather's medical kit, the one he'd used to check the heartbeats of lambs in difficult births, and pressed it to the frozen ground. Feeling foolish, feeling desperate, feeling something she couldn't name. Thump, 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 her own heartbeat traveling through the earth. Or maybe, just maybe, something else. The bank sent a letter in mid-January. Final notice. If she couldn't demonstrate viable agricultural production by the spring assessment, the land would be auctioned. Clara burned the letter in the fireplace and watched the ashes rise up the chimney. She wasn't worried about the bank. She was worried about the seeds in the journal. Her grandfather had written that Frostheart seeds needed something beyond cold. They needed belief, not sentiment, he'd clarified. Pressure. The seed must believe the world will end, must feel the full weight of winter crushing down upon it. Only then does it understand what it's capable of surviving. Clara understood that kind of pressure. She felt it in her chest when she woke at 3 a.m., the farmhouse groaning around her. She felt it in her empty bank account, in the silence of the phone that never rang, in the way the valley had already written her off as another casualty of a dying way of life. February came, and with it, a thaw that lasted exactly 3 days. The snow softened just enough to reveal the red cloth strips, sodden and limp. Clara ran to the field, her boots sinking into slush, her heart hammering. She fell to her knees at the first stake and dug with her bare hands, not caring about the cold, not caring about anything but seeing. 2 inches down, her fingers touched something hard, the seed. Still there, still whole. No sprout, no sign of life, but intact, not rotted, not eaten. She checked all 12. Every one was whole. Everyone was waiting. The temperature plunged again that night, flash freezing the slush into iron. Clara stood at her window and watched the Northfield disappear under fresh ice, and she smiled for the first time since her grandfather's funeral. They were still alive. That was enough. March arrived on the back of a blizzard that the Weather Service called historic and the old-timers called Tuesday. 40 inches of snow in 36 hours. Winds that snapped power lines and buried cars and turned the valley into a white desert. The mountain road closed for good. Millbrook was cut off from the world. Clara spent 3 days in the farmhouse, huddled by the fire, eating canned beans and reading her grandfather's journal by candlelight. She'd read it 100 times, but she kept finding new things. A pressed flower between pages 43 and 44. A recipe for tree paste that included beeswax and something called valley water collected from the spring behind the barn. A sketch of her grandmother's hands holding an apple, drawn with such love that it made Clara's throat ache. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The sky was a blue so sharp it could cut glass. The sun came out with a brilliance that made the snow sparkle like it had been scattered with diamonds. Clara pulled on every piece of clothing she owned. Long johns, wool socks, 2 sweaters, her grandfather's old parka that hung to her knees, a hat that covered her ears, and trudged out to the Northfield. The snow was up to her hips, and she had to fight for every step, plunging and pulling, her lungs burning in the frigid air. The field was transformed. The dead trees wore coats of snow that made them beautiful for the first time in decades. The fence lines had disappeared. The world was reduced to white and blue and the gold of the morning sun. She reached the first stake. The red cloth was invisible, buried under drifts. She dropped to her knees and began to dig. Her fingers found the stake, moved down to where the seed lay, deeper, and then something soft. Something that gave slightly under her touch. Not ice, not frozen earth, green. Clara pulled her hand back and stared. There, in the hole she'd made, was a shoot no thicker than a thread, pale green and impossibly delicate, pushing up through the frozen soil into the air above the snow. She scrambled to the next stake, dug, found another shoot and another 12 holes. 12 green threads reaching toward a winter sun. Clara sat back in the snow and cried. The tears froze on her cheeks, and she didn't care. She laughed and cried and shouted her grandfather's name into the empty valley. and the valley shouted back with silence that felt like approval. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough for her legs to go numb. Long enough for the sun to climb higher and turn the snowfield into a blazing mirror. When she finally stood stiff and shaking, she looked down the row of stakes and saw what the future would look like. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Trees. She marked the sprouts' locations with fresh cloth, bright blue this time, so she could find them when the next snow came, and she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones warmer than any fire, that she would be here to see them grow. Spring came late that year, grudging and cold. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, pulling back from the valley in dirty white lines that revealed mud and dead grass and the debris of winter. The mountain road reopened. The power returned. The world started moving again, but something had shifted in Millbrook Valley. Word had spread about what Clara had found in the snow. Mrs. Calloway came by with a casserole and a confession. "I didn't think it was possible," she admitted, standing in Clara's kitchen, watching the young woman eat like she hadn't seen real food in weeks. Green shoots in February. "I've lived here 60 years, and I've never seen the like." "Neither had I," Clara said, "but my grandfather knew Jed always did have secrets." Mrs. Calloway smiled, a little sad, a little proud. "He'd be happy you're the one who found them." The sprouts grew through April, stubborn and slow. By May, they were 6 inches tall, their leaves a darker green than any apple seedling had a right to be. Clara tended them like they were made of glass. She built wire cages to keep the deer away. She watered them with melted snow collected in barrels, just as the journal instructed. She sang to them in the evening, old songs her grandfather had hummed while he worked, songs about valleys and home, and the stubbornness of things that refused to die. The bank assessor came in June, a thin man in a thin suit who looked at the farmhouse and the dead orchard and the 12 tiny seedlings in the north field with the expression of someone calculating how little he could offer at auction. "Mems. Bennett," he said, clicking his pen, "I'm required to inform you that the bank's patience is not infinite. These," he gestured at the seedlings, "are commendable as a hobby perhaps, but viable agricultural production requires scale, requires output, requires trees that produce fruit, not science experiments." "These trees will produce," Clara said quietly. "When? In 5 years? 10? The loan comes due in 8 months. Then I'll need an extension." The assessor smiled his thin smile. "Extensions require collateral. Do you have collateral, Miss Bennett?" Clara looked at the seedlings, at the north field stretching empty toward the ridge, at the farmhouse that needed a new roof and a new well and 100 other things she couldn't afford. "I have faith," she said. The assessor put away his pen. "Faith doesn't appear on balance sheets." He left. Clara stood in the field until the mosquitoes found her, and then she went inside and opened the journal to the section on accelerated growth. Her grandfather had been impatient too. He'd wanted to see his creation bear fruit in his lifetime. He'd developed techniques, special rootstock, intensive feeding schedules, pruning methods that forced the tree to mature faster, risky techniques, techniques that could kill a young tree if done wrong. Clara studied until her eyes burned. Then she went back out and got to work. Summer passed in a blur of sweat and soil. She took a job at the dairy farm, mucking out barns at 5 a.m. so she could spend the afternoons with her trees. She learned to graft from a retired orchardist 3 valleys over who'd known her grandfather, and agreed to teach her because, as he put it, "Jed owed me $20 from a poker game in '84, and this counts as interest." The old man taught her with weathered hands that moved with surprising gentleness. He showed her how to split the rootstock with a razor-sharp knife, how to slide the scion in at just the right angle, how to wrap the union with waxed twine so tight it would hold through rain and wind. "Grafting is surgery," he told her, watching her first attempt with a critical eye. You're joining two lives into one. Be precise, be patient, be respectful. Clara practiced on spare branches until her fingers cramped. Then she grafted Frostheart scions onto dwarfing rootstock that would force the trees to bear fruit sooner, smaller, but sooner. She built a compost tea brewer from an old garbage can and an aquarium pump, feeding the trees a rich soup of nutrients every week. She pruned with surgical precision, redirecting every ounce of the tree's energy into growth, into strength, into preparation for a winter that was always coming. Her hands were permanently stained with dirt and sap, her nails broken and rimmed with black. She fell asleep at the kitchen table with her face in a bowl of oatmeal more than once, too tired to make it to her bed. The dairy farm work left her back aching, and her boots caked with manure. But every afternoon she walked to the north field and felt her exhaustion lift at the sight of those 12 green lives depending on her. By August, the seedlings had become saplings, 3 feet tall, their trunks as thick as her thumb. The other orchardists in the valley came to look, initially out of curiosity, then out of something else. Wonder, maybe. Or worry. Hargrove came in September, during harvest season when the old trees in the valley were heavy with McIntosh and Cortland and Honeycrisp. He walked the row of Frostheart saplings and said nothing for a long time. They're small, he finally observed. They're young, Clara corrected. Apple trees don't fruit in their second year. Not real fruit. You know that. I know what the books say. Hargrove scratched his jaw. Your grandfather was a good man. A foolish man, but good. He spent 30 years chasing something the rest of us knew was impossible. Don't waste your life the same way. Clara looked at her trees, at the leaves that were already turning a strange silver green at the edges, different from the gold and red of the other orchards, a color she'd only seen in her grandfather's sketches. Thank you for your concern, she said, but I'm not wasting anything. Hargrove left, shaking his head. Clara watched him go and then turned back to her work. She had 12 trees to prepare for winter, and she was running out of time. October brought early frost. November brought freeze. Clara wrapped each sapling in burlap and surrounded them with straw bales, creating little fortresses against the cold. She built a low hoop house over the row. Plastic sheeting stretched over PVC pipe, creating a greenhouse effect that would trap what little heat the winter sun provided. The valley watched and whispered. The girl was building a greenhouse for apple trees that were supposed to love the cold. If she had to protect them, maybe they weren't so special after all. Maybe the shoots in February had been a fluke. Maybe she was as crazy as they said. Clara didn't explain. She couldn't have if she'd wanted to. The hoop house wasn't to protect the trees from winter. It was to protect them from the wrong kind of winter. The Frostheart needed cold, yes, but it needed the cold to come gradually, to harden the wood, to trigger the internal mechanisms that would allow it to bloom in snow. The hoop house moderated the temperature, prevented the extreme swings that could kill a young tree before it learned its own strength. She checked on them every day, peeling back the plastic to look at the silver-green leaves, now fallen, the bare branches reaching up like hands in prayer. The trees were dormant, but they were alive. She could feel it in the flecks of the twigs, in the color of the bark, in something deeper that she didn't have words for. December arrived, and with it, the anniversary of her arrival. 1 year since she'd driven up the mountain road with nothing but grief and determination. 1 year since she'd dug holes in frozen ground and planted hope in the form of 12 seeds. The bank sent another letter. The extension had been denied. The auction was scheduled for the 15th of March. Unless she could produce evidence of viable agricultural income, Clara burned that letter too. She had until March. The Frostheart would bloom in February. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat, the way she knew her grandfather's voice in her head, steady and sure, telling her to keep going. Christmas came and went, lonely and quiet. Clara ate a can of soup for Christmas dinner and read the journal by the fire, finding a passage she'd missed before. Her grandfather, writing about the first time he'd seen the original Frostheart tree bloom. It was the 14th of February, he'd written. Valentine's Day, the worst storm of the year. I'd given up. Stopped checking. Assumed the tree was dead like everything else I'd ever tried. And then I saw it from the kitchen window, pink, against the white. I thought I was hallucinating. I walked out in my socks, no coat, and stood in the snow while the petals opened around me. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen and the most terrifying. Because once you know that something impossible is possible, you can never go back to the way things were. Clara closed the book and looked out her own window. The north field was dark, the hoop house a ghostly shape in the starlight. 24 days until February. She counted them like a prisoner, counting until release. January was cruel. Temperatures dropped to 15 below. The pipes froze. Clara melted snow on the wood stove for water. She lost 5 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. She got sick with a cough that wouldn't quit, hacking into her pillow at night, waking with fever dreams of pink petals falling on white snow. One night, the cough was so bad she couldn't catch her breath. She sat on the edge of her bed, gasping, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering if this was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a wheeze in a freezing farmhouse, surrounded by trees that might never bloom. She thought about calling for help, but the phone lines were down, and the nearest hospital was 40 miles away, and she didn't have anyone to call anyway. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and sat by the fire until dawn, drinking melted snow with a spoonful of honey she'd been saving since summer. The fire popped and crackled, and somewhere in the sound she heard her grandfather's voice. "Not yet, Clara girl. Not yet. You've got work to do." She still checked the trees every day, peeling back the plastic, touching the bark, whispering encouragement to wood that couldn't hear her, or maybe could. Soon, she told them. Soon. The first week of February brought a warming trend. Temperatures climbed into the 20s, then the 30s. The snow softened. Icicles dripped from the eaves. The valley sighed with relief, thinking winter was breaking early. Clara knew better. She'd read her grandfather's notes. The Frostheart didn't bloom in gentle thaws. It bloomed in storms. The temperature drop after a warm spell triggered something in the tree's chemistry, forced it to flower as a survival mechanism, a last desperate attempt to reproduce before the final freeze. She prepared. She checked the hoop house stakes, reinforced the plastic, made sure the trees were ready. On the 10th of February, the temperature hit 42 degrees, unheard of for that time of year. The snow melted into slush. The birds sang confused songs. People in the valley talked about early spring. On the 11th of February, the storm front hit. It came down from Canada with a vengeance. A wall of Arctic air that collided with the warm air and created a blizzard that made the previous year's storm look like a gentle snowfall. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind howled at 50 miles per hour. Snow fell sideways, thick and blinding, accumulating at 2 inches per hour. The power went out at midnight. Clara sat in the dark farmhouse, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind tear at the roof. She wasn't afraid of herself. She was afraid for the trees. At dawn, she couldn't open the front door. Snow had drifted against it, packed tight by the wind. She went out the window, dropping into snow up to her waist, and began the impossible trek to the north field. The world had been erased. No road, no fence, no landmarks, just white and gray and the screaming wind. Clara used the ridge line as her guide, keeping the eastern horizon to her right, fighting through drifts that tried to knock her down, that filled her boots with ice, that burned her face until she couldn't feel her nose or her ears. She found the hoop house by crashing into it. The structure was still standing, barely. The plastic had torn in places, flapping like a wounded bird. Snow had blown inside, covering the straw bales, burying the trunks up to their lowest branches. Clara fell to her knees and began to dig. Her hands were beyond pain now, mechanical things moving on, will alone. She cleared the first tree, the second, the third, and then she stopped. The fourth tree had buds, fat, swollen buds that hadn't been there yesterday, clustered along the branches like pearls on a string. She touched one with a frozen finger and it gave slightly, soft and alive. She checked the fifth tree, buds. The sixth, buds. All 12 trees, every single one, carried the promise of flowers. They'd done it. They'd survived the storm and they were ready. Clara sat back in the snow and laughed. The wind stole the sound, but she didn't care. She stayed there, checking each tree, clearing the snow, until her body began to shut down from the cold, and she had to crawl back to the farmhouse. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the north field, waiting. The 12th of February dawned clear and viciously cold. 10 below zero, the kind of cold that turned breath into crystals before it left your lips. Clara didn't care. She dressed in everything she owned and went out before sunrise. The buds had opened, not all of them, not fully. But the first tree, her grandfather's tree, grown from the first seed she'd planted, had petals. White petals, blushed with pink at the edges, unfurling in air so cold it should have killed them instantly. They trembled in the wind, delicate and impossible, and they did not die. Clara stood in the snow and wept. The tears froze on her face, and she didn't care. She reached out and touched a petal, half expecting it to crumble, to prove itself a hallucination, a trick of grief and desperation. It was real, soft as silk, cool as ice, alive. One by one, the other trees followed. By noon, the entire row was in bloom. 12 apple trees, heavy with flowers, standing in 2 feet of snow while the temperature hovered near zero. The petals caught the sunlight and glowed like they were lit from within, pink and white and impossibly beautiful against the blue-white world. Clara didn't know how long she stood there. Long enough for Mrs. Calloway to spot the color from the road. Long enough for the old woman to call Hargrove. Long enough for the valley to come. They came on snowmobiles and foot, in trucks with chains on the tires and boots wrapped in duct tape. They came with cameras and mouths open and eyes that couldn't believe what they were seeing. They came because word had spread that Jed Bennett's granddaughter had done something impossible, and nobody wanted to miss it. Hargrove was the first to reach the north field. He stood at the edge of the row, his face red from the cold, his breath coming hard from the walk. He looked at the trees, at the snow, at the flowers blooming in air that should have destroyed them. "My God," he whispered. Mrs. Calloway took his arm. "I told you," she said, though she hadn't told anyone anything. "I told you that girl had something." The crowd grew. 24 people, then 3. They stood in a semicircle around the trees, not speaking, just staring. Some of them cried. Some of them prayed. A child, Calloway's granddaughter, reached out to touch a flower, and her mother didn't stop her. Clara stood among her trees, her grandfather's parka hanging on her thin frame, her face chapped and windburned and beautiful with joy. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The trees spoke for her. Hargrove finally found his voice. "How?" he asked. "How is this possible?" Clara touched a branch, let a petal fall into her palm. "My grandfather spent 30 years asking that question," she said. "He found the answer in patience, in belief, in not giving up when everyone said he was crazy." She looked at the crowd, at the faces that had pitied her, mocked her, written her off. "You laughed when I planted seeds in dead winter," she said, not accusing, just stating. You said nothing grows in December. You said I was throwing hope into a graveyard." She held up the petal. "Let the wind take it." It floated through the air, pink and perfect, and landed in the snow at Hargrove's feet. "You were wrong," she said softly. "They don't bloom despite the winter. They bloom because of it. The cold doesn't break them. It makes them." The valley was silent except for the wind. Then Hargrove bent down and picked up the petal. He held it in his thick, work-roof fingers like it was made of gold. "I owe you an apology," he said. "And $20 if we're being honest about old debts." Someone laughed. Then another. The sound spread through the crowd, warm and real, and Clara felt something shift in the valley. Not forgiveness exactly, something better. Respect word spread beyond Millbrook like wildfire. A local reporter came, then a regional one, then agricultural magazines, then national news. The girl with the snow-blooming apple trees, the impossible orchard, the Frostheart apple, named for its ability to flower in the heart of winter. By March, Clara had offers from 3 different agricultural universities wanting to study the variety. She had requests from orchardists across the northern states wanting grafting wood. She had a letter from a venture capitalist offering to fund expansion, to turn Bennett's Hollow into the largest Frostheart orchard in the world. She turned down the venture capitalist. She sold grafting wood at fair prices to anyone who wanted it, with the condition that they plant at least 1 tree in a place where people said nothing could grow. She partnered with the universities, let them study the trees, learn the genetics, understand the mechanism that made the impossible possible. The bank withdrew the foreclosure. The auction was canceled. The assessor came back in his thin suit and offered a 20-year loan extension at favorable rates, which Clara accepted with a handshake and a smile that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't explain. But the real victory wasn't the money. It wasn't the fame. It wasn't the letters or the offers or the reporters who camped in her driveway for weeks. The real victory was the morning of the 14th of February, 1 year after the first bloom, when Clara walked out to the north field and found the trees heavy with fruit. Small apples, no bigger than a child's fist, their skins striped with red and gold, their flesh crisp and sweet with a hint of honey and frost. She picked the first one, held it to the light, bit into it. The taste was like nothing she'd ever known, like summer and winter together, like hope and perseverance distilled into sugar and juice, like her grandfather's voice saying, "I told you so," from somewhere beyond the ridge where the sun first touched the valley each morning. She sat in the snow, eating the apple, watching the petals fall from the new blooms that were already opening, and she knew that some things were worth the wait, worth the work, worth the laughter and the doubt and the lonely nights when the only thing keeping you going was a voice in your head that sounded like love. Years later, people would travel from across the country to see Bennett's Hollow in February. They would stand in the snow and watch the impossible happen, year after year, pink and white against the white. They would bring their children and tell them the story of the girl who planted seeds in winter. They would write books and make documentaries and argue about the science behind it all. But Clara never cared about the science. She cared about the moment. The moment when you stand in the cold and see something beautiful refuse to die. The moment when you realize that the world is full of impossible things, waiting for someone stubborn enough to believe in them. She kept her grandfather's journal on the shelf above the fireplace, its pages now filled with her own handwriting alongside his. The Frostheart orchard grew from 12 trees to 50, then to 200, spreading across the north field like a promise kept. And every February, when the first petals opened in the snow, Clara would walk among them alone before the crowds came, and she would whisper the same words her grandfather had taught her: grow. And they always did. They laughed when she planted apple seeds in dead winter. They laughed until the trees bloomed in snow, and they never laughed again.